I am Arthur Sterling, 26 years old. 4 years ago, my own parents handed me a formal disownment letter at a 5-star restaurant, fully expecting me to break down, cry, and beg on my hands and knees for my inheritance. While I was sitting there, trying to process the absolute, cold-blooded betrayal of my own blood, my mother leaned across the pristine white tablecloth and told me, in a voice coated with rehearsed fake concern, that this was a clean break. My older brother Edward literally had his smartphone propped up against his crystal water glass, the red recording light glowing ominously as he filmed my face. They wanted to capture my humiliation. They wanted to broadcast my destruction. They laughed at me in front of the entire elite dining room of Maison Lumière, waiting for me to shatter into a million pieces. But there is one thing they did not know. Inside my tailored jacket pocket, resting right next to my pounding heart, was a newly signed legal contract for the acquisition of my tech company. It was worth over $7 million. And now, years later, those exact same people are the ones standing outside my corporate office building, begging for my help, drowning in debt, and facing a massive lawsuit. Before I tell you exactly what happened and how I completely flipped the script on my toxic family, hit the like button if you believe that karma never misses an address. And do not forget to tell me where you are watching from in the comments section below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let us go back to the exact moment everything broke. The air conditioning vent above our table blew directly onto my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. But the chill I felt had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The French restaurant's ambient noise, the clinking of silver forks, the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers, the hushed conversations of Chicago's elite, faded to a distant, muffled hum as the blood rushed to my ears. The heavy cream-colored envelope cracked open between my fingers. The sound was as sharp and final as a bone breaking. I stared down at the thick legal paper. My father's fountain pen signature bled across the bottom of the page, a harsh, authoritative stroke of black ink. It was the exact same expensive, limited edition pen he had used to sign massive real estate contracts, authorize ruthless corporate takeovers, and sign my Harvard acceptance letter years ago. The restaurant's massive crystal chandelier caught the light of my mother's diamond tennis bracelet as she leaned back in her plush chair, looking completely and utterly satisfied with her cruelty. They had arranged this extravagant dinner under the absolute guise of celebrating my college graduation, but it was nothing more than a meticulously planned execution. They wanted to cut me off, erase my name from the Sterling family legacy, and make sure I knew exactly how worthless they thought I was. I watched my own hands. They were remarkably steady. My fingers did not tremble as I carefully folded the heavy paper in half, then into precise quarters. My father checked his limited edition Patek Philippe watch with a heavy, dramatic sigh. It was the exact same dismissive, impatient gesture he used at every single parent-teacher conference he had ever bothered to attend during my childhood. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes, entirely devoid of any paternal warmth, and asked if I had anything I wanted to say. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. I did not give them the dramatic reaction they were so desperately waiting for. I just looked at them. The three people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, the people who were supposed to be my safety net, had turned my entire existence into a failed business transaction. And they had just unilaterally terminated my contract. To truly understand how we ended up at this miserable, suffocating dinner table, you have to understand the deeply entrenched dynamics of the Sterling family. We were not just wealthy. We were old money. We were the kind of family that had massive hospital wings named after our ancestors, the kind of family that ruthlessly guarded our social standing at exclusive country clubs and high-stakes charity galas. For 3 uninterrupted generations, the Sterling men were legendary investment bankers. The path was set in stone before I was even born. We went to elite, ridiculously expensive Ivy League prep schools, secured our degrees in finance or economics, and then took our designated, leather-bound seats in the family boardroom to multiply the family fortune. My older brother Edward was the quintessential golden child. He played their twisted game perfectly. He wore the right tailored suits, dated the right women from equally prominent families, and repeated our father's cutthroat corporate buzzwords like a well-trained parrot. I was different. I was supposed to follow the exact same tradition, get my undergraduate degree from Wharton, and march straight into the family firm. But during my sophomore year of college, I found my true passion, and it had absolutely nothing to do with manipulating the stock market. I developed an absolute, all-consuming obsession with algorithms, data structures, and efficiency metrics. I realized with absolute clarity that I did not want to spend the rest of my life trading stocks, breaking apart small companies for a quick profit, and living in the shadow of my father's ruthless reputation. I wanted to build things. I wanted to solve actual, tangible, real-world problems. So, I made the single decision that ruined my standing in the family hierarchy forever. I switched my major from finance to data science. I remember the exact moment I told my father. It is burned into my memory. I was standing in his massive, cavernous home office in our Chicago lakefront mansion. I was surrounded by dark mahogany wood paneling, expensive oil paintings, and leather-bound books that absolutely nobody ever read. I tried to explain my vision to him calmly. I told him that numbers are numbers, and I was just using them differently to build something sustainable. I genuinely thought he would respect the logic. I thought, naively, that he would see the massive potential and the future in what I was doing. Instead, he stood up slowly, slammed both of his heavy hands onto his immaculate mahogany desk, and glared at me with a level of absolute disgust I had never seen before. He looked at me not as a son, but as a liability. He told me, his voice dangerously low, that family tradition is not a math problem you can optimize. He said I was throwing away my entire future, embarrassing the pristine sterling name, and acting like an arrogant, ungrateful child who did not understand how the real world operated. I tried to reason with him. I brought up the undeniable fact that tech was the future, that data science was fundamentally revolutionizing every major industry on the planet. He did not care. To Charles Sterling, anything outside of his narrow, profit-driven worldview was an immediate threat to his control. That single, explosive conversation fractured my family permanently. The consequences were immediate, calculated, and entirely brutal. I walked out of that mahogany office thinking the worst of the fallout was over, thinking we just needed time to cool off. I was so incredibly, tragically wrong. The silent treatment began the very next morning, and it was executed with the precision of a military operation. It was not a dramatic, screaming blow-up, but rather a slow, methodical, and agonizing erasure of my entire existence from the family unit. Their communication strategy shifted overnight. Any questions about my classes, my well-being, or my life completely stopped. Weekly family dinner invitations dwindled to absolutely nothing. Family photos for the annual, highly publicized holiday cards suddenly no longer required my presence. I was effectively a ghost in my own family. Then came the financial strike. They did not even have the decency to call me. I received a brief, legally sterile email from my father's personal assistant informing me that my college fund was being permanently frozen. The generous monthly allowance I had received since high school was instantly revoked. I was completely, utterly cut off. I had to scramble, panicking in my dorm room, trying to figure out how to pay my skyrocketing tuition and keep a roof over my head. My mother would occasionally send these passive-aggressive, deeply manipulative text messages saying they completely understood if I was too busy with my little computer projects to come home for Thanksgiving dinners. It was pure psychological warfare. They wanted to starve me out. They wanted me to fail so miserably, so publicly, that I would come crawling back to their doorstep, begging for my old life, ready to wear the conservative suit and tie they had picked out for me. They even used my absence at a distant relative's funeral as proof to the rest of the extended family that I had lost my mind and abandoned my values. My brother Edward gladly became their primary proxy. He had just received a massive, highly publicized promotion at the family firm, and he absolutely loved to rub his exorbitant salary, his hefty corporate bonuses, and his pristine 401k matching benefits right in my face. He would call me occasionally, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. He would report mundane family news, talk loudly about the new luxury sports cars he was test driving, and constantly remind me of the massive expectations I was failing to meet. He always made sure to casually mention that the junior analyst position was still open if I ever decided to stop playing around and get a real job like a grown man. I told him, trying to keep my voice steady, that I was building something different. Edward just laughed. A harsh, grating sound. He said different is not always better, and sometimes different is just difficult. In his eyes, I was just a massive, pathetic disappointment. I had to survive. I had no other choice. I took a grueling job at a loud, chaotic, relentlessly busy coffee shop right near campus, just to cover the rent for a tiny, run-down, freezing apartment I shared with 2 other struggling engineering students. The constant, deafening hiss of the espresso machine and the endless, mindless chatter of rude customers became the new, exhausting soundtrack to my life. It was a sharp, jarring, and incredibly humbling contrast to the cathedral-like silence of my family's massive, pristine estate. I worked brutal double shifts, dealing with entitled customers who screamed at me over foam ratios, wiping down sticky, gross tables, and literally counting out loose change just to buy cheap ramen noodles at Walmart. My feet ached constantly. My back was always tight. I was exhausted right down to the marrow of my bones. But I absolutely refused to quit. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my failure. Between my exhausting shifts, I sat at a wobbly, sticky corner table in the back of the shop, put my headphones on, and coded. I poured every single ounce of my frustration, my simmering anger, and my desperate need for independence into my battered laptop. I was building a complex system. It started as a simple, standard class project, but as I poured my soul into it, it quickly evolved into something much larger and significantly more powerful. I called it root logic. It was an advanced, highly sophisticated algorithm designed to perfectly optimize coffee bean delivery schedules and supply chains for small businesses. Coffee shop owners dealt with constant, massive headaches regarding small shipments, minimal storage space, and wildly unpredictable customer demand. My software analyzed local events, complex weather patterns, and years of historical sales data to predict exactly, down to the ounce, how much inventory was needed. I finally convinced the incredibly skeptical owner of the coffee shop to let me run a live, real-world test on his inventory. During the very first month alone, my automated solution reduced his product waste by a staggering 23%. The owner was absolutely thrilled. He actually hugged me in the cramped back kitchen, tears in his eyes because I had just saved his struggling business from going under. For the first time in my entire life, I felt truly, deeply valued for something I created with my own 2 hands, using my own intellect, completely separate from the sterling family wealth. My advanced analytics professor, Dr. Vance, noticed the project during my midterm reviews. Initially, I thought he was going to be a mentor, someone who finally supported me. He looked at my intricate data models, adjusted his glasses, and told me that supply chain optimization at this specific scale could completely transform small business logistics nationwide. He said it had massive potential far beyond coffee beans. I was ecstatic. I thought I finally had a powerful ally in the academic world. But the corporate world is absolutely full of ruthless vultures, and I quickly learned that academia is no different. A week later, Dr. Vance called me into his quiet, secluded office. He slid a thick stack of papers across his desk. He handed me a fully drafted patent application for root logic. I looked down at the legal paperwork and felt all the blood drain rapidly from my face. He had explicitly listed himself as the primary inventor and the 70% majority owner of the software. He smiled this sickening, predatory, condescending smile and told me that without his university resources and his brilliant guidance, my little student project was essentially nothing. He casually, coldly mentioned that if I dared to fight him on this, he would make sure I failed his class, lost my remaining credits, and got permanently blacklisted from the university's highly coveted tech incubator program. He even threw around the word lawsuit, threatening to tie me up in expensive legal battles for years until I was completely bankrupt. I gripped the wooden arms of the chair until my knuckles turned stark white. My own family had cruelly cast me out, left me to fend for myself, and now this arrogant man was trying to legally steal my only lifeline, my only chance at a future. I stood up slowly, looked him dead in his cowardly eyes, and told him, my voice completely steady, that I would rather burn the entire source code to the ground and salt the earth than let him steal a single line of my work. I walked right out of his office, immediately dropped his class, and took my project entirely independent. I recruited 2 incredibly brilliant people from my dorm who believed in my vision. Marcus, a genius UX designer who was just as hungry and broke as I was, and Chloe, a fierce, take-no-prisoners communications major who handled our client relations and aggressively protected us from toxic investors. We officially formed our own family. We worked entirely out of my cramped, freezing apartment, eating cheap food, wearing heavy coats indoors because we couldn't afford the heating bill, and staying awake for 48 hours straight to refine the massive algorithm. We bypassed the corrupt university system entirely and started pitching directly to local, independent businesses. We were gaining serious, undeniable traction. By the time spring rolled around, we had real, paying clients and hard, undeniable data proving our system worked flawlessly under intense pressure. We were actively preparing for our first major pitch to a high-tier venture capital firm. We were finally going to get massive seed funding. I truly thought the brutal struggle was finally paying off. I thought the worst of my nightmare was permanently behind me. I was completely, horribly, and devastatingly wrong. The week before our massive, life-changing pitch to the venture capital firm, absolute disaster struck with the force of a freight train. I woke up on a gloomy Tuesday morning, made my incredibly cheap instant coffee, and opened my laptop to run a final, routine diagnostic check on the root logic prototype. The core directory folder was entirely empty. I blinked hard, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes, genuinely thinking it was just a simple cloud syncing error. My heart started to beat a little faster. I frantically dug through the secure cloud backups. Empty. I checked the local physical server drives we had set up in the closet. Wiped completely clean. Pure, unfiltered panic hit me like a physical punch right to the center of my chest. 3 grueling years of relentless coding, thousands of sleepless nights, sacrificed relationships, and every single ounce of my sanity were just completely gone. I frantically called Marcus, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice. He rushed over in his pajamas, and we spent 6 agonizing, terrifying hours tracing the digital footprint of the wipe. We finally found the breach in the system logs. It was not a remote, sophisticated hack by a rival tech company. Someone had manually plugged into the mainframe, copied the master source code onto an external physical drive, and then intentionally initiated a deep, unrecoverable military-grade wipe of all our systems. And the access logs pointed directly, undeniably, to Greg. Greg was my college roommate. He was a guy I had shared countless meals with, a guy who knew exactly how much I was struggling just to keep the lights on and pay the rent. I confronted him in the cramped kitchen. I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. I just slowly turned the laptop screen toward him and showed him the undeniable access logs. He could not even look me in the eye. He stared down at the scuffed linoleum floor, his face pale, and confessed to absolutely everything. He told me, his voice trembling, that he was drowning in massive student loan debt and desperately needed cash to pay off some shady creditors. But the real, agonizing knife twist was when he revealed exactly who had bought him out. Greg admitted that a man in a tailored, ridiculously expensive Italian suit had approached him at a dive bar near the campus. The man knew my full name. The man knew all about the Root Logic project. The man offered Greg $50,000 in crisp, untraceable cash to hand over the drive and permanently wipe my machine. It was Edward, my own brother. Edward had used a tiny fraction of his bloated, disgusting corporate salary to maliciously bribe a desperate college student just to completely destroy my life's work. I felt a cold, blinding, all-consuming rage wash over my entire body. It was a betrayal so deep it actually made me physically nauseous. I grabbed my phone, my fingers gripping the plastic case tight enough to crack it, and dialed Edward's personal number. He answered on the second ring, sounding completely cheerful, almost giddy. The background noise sounded like the gentle breeze and polite clapping of an incredibly expensive, exclusive golf course. I asked him, my voice dangerously quiet, why he did it. Edward just let out a dark, mocking, deeply arrogant laugh. He told me he was actually doing me a massive favor. He said it was high time for me to stop playing silly little computer games in a slum apartment and come back to reality. He casually, sickeningly mentioned that the family firm was expanding its tech division and they could always use a low-level IT guy to fix the jam printers and fetch coffee. He ended the call by saying, in a voice dripping with venom, that the game was officially over and I had lost. I dropped my phone onto the kitchen counter. The silence in the apartment was deafening, suffocating. My own flesh and blood, the people who shared my DNA, had actively, maliciously sabotaged my entire future just to prove a sadistic point and force my submission. They wanted me destitute. They wanted me totally broken. They wanted to strip away every ounce of my dignity until I begged them for a paycheck. I looked over at Marcus and Chloe. They were standing by the doorway, looking absolutely defeated, their dreams shattered on the floor. We had absolutely no product to show. We had no pitch for the investors. We had roughly $5 in our collective bank accounts. We were completely dead in the water. Marcus, usually the optimist, quietly suggested we just give up and cut our losses. Chloe started looking up entry-level, soul-crushing corporate jobs on her phone, tears silently streaming down her face. I walked over to the kitchen sink, splashed freezing cold water on my face, and looked deeply into the cracked mirror. I saw the dark, heavy circles under my eyes. I saw the frayed, worn-out collar of my cheap thrift store shirt. But I also saw a raging, unquenchable fire that Edward and my father, with all their millions, could never possibly understand or extinguish. I turned back to my team. I stood tall. I told them we were absolutely not quitting. I told them that Edward had stolen the old, outdated code, but the real, true algorithm was not on that physical hard drive. It was locked safely inside my head, and the old code was flawed anyway. It was clunky. It had hidden security vulnerabilities. I told them we were going to lock the apartment doors, turn off our phones, ignore the outside world, and rebuild the entire massive system from absolute scratch. We were going to build it faster, lighter, more intuitive, and aggressively more secure than before. For the next 2 solid months, we went into absolute monk-like isolation. We barely slept. We barely ate anything other than plain rice and beans. I coded with a level of ferocity, speed, and hyperfocus I did not even know I possessed. We built a completely new, revolutionary architecture, utilizing incredibly advanced machine learning models that the original stolen version completely lacked. We made root logic completely, undeniably untouchable. If Edward tried to run the old code, it would quickly become obsolete garbage compared to what we were building now. And then, a massive miracle happened. Chloe, using her relentless networking skills, managed to secure a desperate, last-minute 10-minute meeting with Sarah, a legendary, notoriously tough angel investor known for exclusively backing highly disruptive tech startups. We walked into her massive, intimidating glass office in downtown Chicago with absolutely nothing but a single laptop and a raw, functioning, lightning-fast prototype. We did not have fancy, expensive slide decks or polished, empty corporate buzzwords. I just opened the laptop and showed her the raw math. I showed her the live, real-time data from our beta testers proving massive profit margins. Sarah sat perfectly quietly for a long time, scrutinizing the complex numbers on the screen. She looked deeply at me, saw the absolute desperation, the trauma, and the unyielding determination in my eyes, and slowly closed the laptop. She didn't hesitate. She offered us $2.4 million in seed funding right there on the spot. When those massive funds officially hit our newly formed corporate bank account a week later, I did not celebrate with expensive champagne or a lavish dinner. I walked out of the bank, stood on the loud, busy Chicago sidewalk, and pulled out my phone. I opened my digital notepad where I kept my master target list of potential massive enterprise clients. Right in the middle of the list, glaring at me, was the Sterling Financial Group. I stared at the name of my family's empire. Then, I highlighted the name, pressed delete, and completely, permanently erased them from my future. I was no longer seeking their approval. I was no longer hoping they would finally see my value. To me, they were dead. We moved into a real, legitimate office space that very summer. It was nothing fancy, just an open-concept loft with exposed brick walls and questionable heating in the winter. But it was ours. The team rapidly expanded to 12 brilliant, dedicated people. We were aggressively securing massive contracts, rapidly expanding our reach across state lines, and fundamentally changing how major logistics companies operated. I was finally, truly building my own legacy, entirely free from the toxic Sterling name. But the storm was not over. In fact, the real, devastating hurricane was just forming off the coast, and my family was entirely, blissfully unaware of the absolute monster I had become in the business world. The real, earth-shattering turning point came when James Harrison officially reached out to my team. Mr. Harrison was the fiercely respected CEO of North Star Logistics, a massive, multi-billion-dollar enterprise that handled highly complex supply chains for Fortune 500 companies globally. His massive company desperately needed exactly what we had built. They were bleeding millions of dollars in operational inefficiencies and wasted resources every single quarter, and their legacy systems were failing. They did not just want to become a high-paying client. They wanted to own the technology outright. They wanted to formally acquire us. The initial opening offer came in at a staggering $5.8 million. Chloe, Marcus, and I sat in our small, glass-walled conference room, staring in absolute, stunned silence at the number printed on the digital contract draft. It was more money than any of us had ever seen in our entire lives. It was life-changing, generational wealth. But I knew our true worth. I knew exactly what my software could do for their bottom line over the next decade. I pushed back hard. I negotiated with the exact same ruthless, cold-blooded, highly aggressive tactics I had watched my father use during his hostile corporate takeovers when I was a child. The massive difference was, I was defending something I actually created with my own brilliance, not tearing apart someone else's livelihood. After 2 agonizing, highly stressful weeks of intense legal posturing and aggressive financial negotiation, we finally settled on a final, undeniable figure: $7.2 million. The massive deal also included ironclad guaranteed positions for my entire 12-person team, with comprehensive, top-tier medical benefits, and a highly lucrative director of implementation strategy role specifically for me. The final contracts were signed on a quiet, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. There was no grand parade down the street. There were no flashing cameras or press tours. Just the quiet, satisfying scratch of a pen on paper and the heavy, profound thud of reality settling deep into my bones. I was exactly 26 years old, completely and utterly self-made, and a multimillionaire. My Uncle Henry, the family's resident snake, tried to snoop around that exact same week. Henry was my father's younger brother, a cowardly man who always played the role of the sympathetic, caring relative. He would occasionally text me to ask how I was doing, pretending to genuinely care about my struggles. But I knew the absolute truth. Henry was a spy. He was reporting every single detail of my misery back to my father, hoping to earn brownie points and secure a larger, more lucrative slice of the family inheritance when my father inevitably passed. He called me on a Wednesday, his voice overly cheerful, aggressively probing about my living situation and casually asking if I needed a small, pitiful loan to keep my little computer club running. He wanted to hear that I was failing. I gave him absolutely nothing. I kept my voice perfectly flat, devoid of any emotion, told him I was managing just fine, and hung up the phone without another word. Then the official invitation arrived. My mother sent a perfectly curated, sickeningly sweet text message, dripping with fake, manufactured warmth. She suggested a highly formal family dinner at Maison Lumière on Saturday evening to supposedly, finally celebrate my graduation. It was the exact, highly exclusive restaurant where the Sterling family celebrated all significant major milestones. I knew immediately, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was a carefully laid trap. They had ignored my actual graduation ceremony entirely. They had ignored my existence for years, letting me rot in poverty. They were absolutely not taking me to a 5-star French restaurant to buy me an expensive steak and tell me they were proud of my resilience. They were setting a grand, theatrical stage for something malicious. I replied with a simple, cold text. I will be there. The day before the fateful dinner, I met with my highly skilled personal attorney, Lawyer Miller. I sat in his quiet, mahogany-paneled, leather-scented office, a stark contrast to my father's, and meticulously reviewed a very specific, highly important set of legal documents. I was officially initiating the complex legal process to completely, permanently strip the Sterling name from my identity. I was legally changing my last name. I signed the heavy paperwork, paid his exorbitant retainer fee without blinking, and walked out of the towering legal building feeling lighter, freer, and more powerful than I had in my entire life. That night, I sat completely alone in my quiet, peaceful apartment. I surrounded myself on the floor with the physical, undeniable proof of my existence and my triumph. The massive acquisition paperwork from North Star Logistics, the glossy press releases scheduled to go public on Monday morning to the financial world, and my framed university diploma. I gathered all of it, every single sheet of paper, and slid the documents into a sleek, incredibly expensive black leather portfolio. It was the exact type of pretentious, high-end corporate accessory my father would respect. I arrived at Maison Lumière precisely on time the next evening, dressed in a sharp, perfectly tailored suit that cost more than my first car. The snooty maitre d' hesitated slightly when I gave him my name. He checked his glowing digital tablet, looking slightly confused and annoyed. He informed me, in a clipped tone, that he had the Sterling family listed as 4 guests, but only 3 had arrived, heavily implying my name was not even officially on the VIP reservation list. I was not an honored guest. I was merely an item on their cruel agenda. I maintained hard, unflinching eye contact with the man, told him in a voice that commanded absolute authority that I was the 4th, and forced him to lead me straight into the dining room. I navigated smoothly through the dimly lit, opulent restaurant, walking past crowded tables of Chicago's elite, discussing complex market trends, corporate mergers, and luxury real estate acquisitions. I spotted them immediately. My father, my mother, and Edward. They were positioned perfectly, strategically in the exact center of the room, ready for their grand public performance. I took a deep, steadying breath, clutching the heavy leather portfolio tightly under my arm, and stepped directly into the lion's den. I truly thought the worst was over. I thought I was fully prepared for whatever petty insults they were going to throw at me. I was so incredibly, dangerously wrong about exactly how far they were willing to go to destroy me. I walked into Maison Lumière with the heavy black leather portfolio tucked firmly under my right arm. The air inside the incredibly exclusive restaurant was thick with the rich scent of roasted truffles, expensive heavy cream, and the undeniable, suffocating perfume of sheer arrogance. This was not a place people came to enjoy a simple meal. This was a place where Chicago's absolute elite came to be seen, to orchestrate massive corporate mergers, and to ruthlessly flaunt their generational wealth. The snooty maitre d', finally accepting that I was indeed part of the reservation, led me through the maze of white-clothed tables toward the center of the main dining floor. My family had selected a table that was positioned perfectly, with the strategic precision of a military general planning an ambush. It was central enough to be seen by all the important socialites, politicians, and corporate executives in the room, yet just private enough to conduct their sinister little family business without causing a loud public scene. They wanted witnesses to their power, but they did not want anyone close enough to hear the actual cruelty of their words. My mother, Victoria, had already arranged herself in her plush, maroon velvet chair like she was posing for the front cover of a high-end luxury lifestyle magazine. Her tailored silk blouse perfectly matched the cream-colored linen dinner napkins, and her posture was rigidly, unnaturally straight. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers above us, flashing brilliantly with every tiny movement of her wrist. My father, Charles, was intensely studying the thick, leather-bound wine list with a completely unnecessary level of deep concentration, completely ignoring my approach. It was a classic power move. He wanted to establish immediately that I was not worth his immediate attention. And then there was Edward. My older brother was aggressively angling his chair, subtly adjusting his expensive smartphone against his crystal water glass, so the high-definition camera lens had a clear, unobstructed view of the empty chair waiting for me. He was optimizing his angles for social media documentation. He wanted to make sure the lighting was perfect when he captured my absolute destruction. As I approached the table, my mother finally looked up. She did not stand. She did not offer a genuine, warm smile. She simply performed a highly theatrical air kiss a few inches away from both of my cheeks, making sure not to smudge her expensive makeup. She announced to the table, in a tone dripping with mocking sarcasm, that the guest of honor had finally arrived. I accepted the fake performance for exactly what it was. I did not flinch. I did not show an ounce of the anxiety that used to paralyze me in their presence. I pulled out my heavy oak chair and took my designated seat, placing my sleek leather portfolio gently on the table next to my polished silver forks. Almost immediately, a young waiter dressed in a pristine, perfectly pressed white tuxedo jacket appeared at my shoulder holding a chilled, condensation-covered bottle of vintage champagne. He began pouring the sparkling liquid into 4 delicate crystal flutes with practiced, mechanical precision. To celebrate the graduate, the waiter announced with a bright, entirely oblivious smile, completely unaware of the heavy, toxic tension radiating from our table. The poor guy had absolutely no idea he had just walked right into a meticulously planned execution. My father finally lowered the heavy wine list. He reached out with his thick, gold-ringed fingers, picked up his crystal flute, and raised it into the air. He did not look me in the eye. He looked slightly past me, toward the kitchen, and simply offered a cold, generic, entirely emotionless toast to endings and beginnings. We all took a sip in absolute silence. The expensive champagne tasted like absolutely nothing to me. It might as well have been tap water. The exact moment the waiter stepped away and disappeared back into the busy kitchen, the entire atmosphere at the table shifted violently. The fake, camera-ready smiles instantly vanished from their faces. The theatrical, polite pleasantries were abruptly terminated. We were officially down to business. My mother reached down into her designer leather handbag resting by her feet on the plush carpet. With agonizing, dramatic slowness, she withdrew a thick, heavyweight cream-colored envelope. She placed it deliberately and precisely beside my small porcelain bread plate. I stared down at the paper. I knew immediately what it was before I even touched it. It was the exact type of heavy, expensive textured paper my father's cutthroat corporate lawyers used for permanent financial records, hostile company takeovers, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. It was the paper of finality. My mother folded her perfectly manicured hands neatly on the table. She looked at me with eyes that held absolutely zero maternal warmth, zero empathy, and zero regret. She began speaking in a carefully modulated, therapy-practiced voice that hit the absolute perfect note of compassionate detachment. She told me that they had given this situation considerable, agonizing thought over the past few years. She said they had consulted heavily with their elite legal team and their senior financial advisors. And then, she delivered the final, calculated blow. She said they believed the specific, unfortunate arrangement would absolutely benefit everyone moving forward. "We think this is best for everyone," she said smoothly, her voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. Clean break. Edward still did not say a single word, but I saw his hand subtly slide beneath the white tablecloth to tap the screen of his phone. I caught the faint, glowing red recording light reflecting perfectly off his crystal water glass. My own flesh and blood, the brother I grew up with, was actively recording this deeply private moment so he could rewatch my absolute humiliation later. He probably planned to share it in his private group chats with his wealthy, arrogant friends to show them how pathetic the black sheep of the Sterling family truly was. They were all sitting there, their cold eyes completely fixed on my face, eagerly anticipating the breakdown. They fully, confidently expected tears. They expected outrage. They expected a desperate, pathetic emotional display of a broken son begging for his family's love. They desperately wanted a final, dramatic performance from the family disappointment before they discarded me into the trash forever. I absolutely refused to give them a single drop of that sick satisfaction. I reached out slowly and picked up the envelope. The paper was incredibly thick, substantial, and heavy with legal threats. I broke the embossed wax seal with my thumb, and the envelope cracked open between my fingers. The sound was sharp in my ears. I slid the legal document out and unfolded it flat onto the table. It was exactly what I thought it was. A formal, legally binding disownment letter. Legally speaking, the document was entirely unnecessary. I was a grown, 26-year-old adult man. I had absolutely zero financial ties to them anymore, and I had not taken a single dime of their money in over 4 years. But symbolically, this piece of paper was everything to their massive, fragile egos. It was the powerful Sterling family formally, aggressively, and publicly severing all possible ties with its wayward, disobedient son. The legal jargon printed on the page was incredibly dense, undoubtedly drafted and heavily scrutinized for billable hours by my father's ruthless team of lawyers. The document explicitly acknowledged my choice to intentionally pursue alternative, unapproved career options entirely outside the designated family business. It formally, permanently released me from all future obligations, all societal expectations, and any future financial benefits or inheritance associated with the powerful Sterling name. Translation: I was being completely, thoroughly erased from their history. Beneath the cold, sterile formality of the printed text, 3 handwritten signatures formed a perfect, undeniable row at the bottom of the final page. I saw my father Charles's authoritative, heavy black ink strokes, my mother Victoria's elegant, sweeping, practiced curves, and Edward's hasty, aggressive scrawl. They had all eagerly signed off on my execution without a second thought. My mother continued her pre-rehearsed, nauseatingly polite speech about protecting family legacies, maintaining high social standards in the community, and understanding that some people simply choose different, lesser paths in life. I ignored her voice entirely. I blocked out the sound of her words and simply read every single line of the document carefully, letting the absolute, undeniable reality of their deep betrayal sink deep into my bones. This was the family that was supposed to protect me from the world. This was the father who was supposed to guide me, the mother who was supposed to comfort me, the older brother who was supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. And they had willingly reduced our entire lifelong relationship to a legally binding termination contract. I felt the restaurant's air conditioning vent blowing cold, harsh air directly onto the back of my neck, but the blood rushing through my veins was incredibly hot. However, my physical reaction was entirely under my control. I watched my own hands, and they remained perfectly, remarkably steady. I did not shake. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or beg for my rightful inheritance. I simply finished reading the final threatening paragraph, looked down at the 3 signatures one last time, and slowly, deliberately folded the heavy paper precisely in half. Then, I folded it again into crisp, neat quarters. I looked up from the table. The sudden silence at our table was absolutely deafening. My family was staring at me, their mouths slightly parted, utterly bewildered by my absolute, chilling lack of reaction. Their perfect, dramatic narrative was completely derailing right in front of their eyes, and their arrogant brains had absolutely no idea how to process my silence. My father leaned forward heavily in his chair, his thick brow furrowing in genuine, deeply unsettled confusion. He checked his outrageously expensive Patek Philippe watch again, clearly annoyed that I was completely ruining the timeline of the script they had meticulously written for me. He looked at me, his voice carrying that familiar, commanding boardroom tone that usually made grown men cower, and asked if there was absolutely anything I would like to say before we concluded this unpleasant business. I looked him dead in the eye, refusing to blink. I took the folded disownment letter and slipped it directly into the inside breast pocket of my tailored blazer, resting it right over my heart. I kept my voice incredibly level, perfectly matching his cold, calculated, emotionless energy. I refused to give him the power of my anger. "Is that all you have for me?" I asked quietly, My father's thick eyebrows rose slightly in genuine surprise. It was the most raw, unfiltered emotion I had seen him display in a public setting in over a decade. He cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. "You are taking this surprisingly well, Arthur," he noted, sounding almost deeply disappointed that I was not sobbing onto the tablecloth. "What exactly did you expect, Charles?" I asked, intentionally completely dropping the title of Dad forever. "Did you honestly expect tears? Did you expect a massive public scene that would embarrass you in front of your country club friends? Did you expect me to get on my knees and beg for a college fund you maliciously froze 4 years ago?" I leaned back comfortably in my chair, radiating absolute, unshakable calm. "I think everything here is perfectly crystal clear to me." My mother shifted incredibly uncomfortably in her maroon velvet chair. Her perfectly planned, heavily rehearsed script was falling apart rapidly. She offered a very nervous, strained, entirely fake smile, looking around the room to make sure nobody was watching us. We simply thought you might have some desperate questions about the logistics of the legal separation," she stammered, her voice losing its smooth polish. "I have absolutely no questions for you," I replied smoothly, my voice cutting through the tension. "But as it happens, I do have something for you as well. Consider it a final parting gift." I reached across the pristine white tablecloth and pulled my heavy black leather portfolio directly toward me. I unzipped it incredibly slowly, letting the heavy suspense hang in the air, choking them. I reached inside the dark leather and withdrew a thick, substantial stack of pristine, newly printed legal documents. I pulled out the final, signed acquisition contracts from North Star Logistics, the detailed, highly confidential financial slides from our final executive board presentation, and the glossy, finalized press release that was scheduled to hit every major financial news outlet and stock ticker on Monday morning. I arranged the documents in a perfectly neat, undeniable, overlapping row right on the table, placing them deliberately between the woven bread baskets and their crystal water glasses. My father's deeply ingrained corporate instincts kicked in instantly. His attention sharpened immediately like a predator smelling fresh blood in the water. He could not help himself. High-level financial documents triggered his professional interest despite his profound personal disdain for me. "What exactly is this?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave into a low, serious growl. "This is my alternative career option," I stated plainly, using the exact insulting phrasing from his disownment letter. I reached out and tapped my index finger directly and firmly on the North Star Logistics corporate logo embossed proudly at the top of the first thick page. "They officially, fully acquired my tech company 2 days ago. The massive public announcement goes live to the entire market on Monday morning. I just thought you should hear it directly from me before you read about your massive failure in the Wall Street Journal." Edward actually laughed out loud. It was a highly nervous, high-pitched, disbelieving sound that echoed slightly. He lowered his phone, completely forgetting to record the moment as panic set in. "Your company?" he sneered, trying desperately to regain his footing. "You mean that little coffee bean tracker you were playing with in your filthy dorm room? The one I—" He stopped himself abruptly, his face going pale as he realized he was about to publicly admit to corporate sabotage and bribery in a 5-star restaurant. "Root logic," I corrected him, my voice slicing through the air like a freshly sharpened razor blade. "The incredibly advanced supply chain optimization system I have been building entirely from scratch for the past 3 grueling years. The one you never bothered to ask about. The exact one you paid my roommate to try and destroy." I held Edward's terrified gaze until he physically looked down at his lap, acting completely cowardly. I turned my full attention back to my father. He had already eagerly picked up the executive summary document. His eyes were darting rapidly and frantically across the page, his brilliant, calculating financial mind automatically calculating the aggressive valuations, the stock options, and the ironclad acquisition terms. I watched his face closer than I ever had in my life. I saw the exact, precise microsecond his eyes landed heavily on the final buyout figure printed prominently in bold black ink at the bottom of the page. $7.2 million. The healthy color completely drained from his face in an instant. The mighty, untouchable Charles Sterling looked as though he had just been violently punched in the stomach by a heavyweight fighter. He dropped the heavy paper back onto the table, his hands actually trembling slightly. This is legitimate?" he stammered, entirely unable to keep the absolute, world-shattering shock out of his voice. "Completely, legally legitimate," I replied, keeping my tone as light and conversational as though we were discussing the upcoming weekend weather forecast. "I am officially joining their executive board as the Director of Implementation Strategy next month with a massive salary and full benefits. We have already officially secured massive, multi-year contracts with 3 major Fortune 500 companies. The payout is fully guaranteed and sitting comfortably in a trust." My mother's flawless, heavily manufactured composure finally cracked wide open. Her mouth literally hung open slightly in pure shock. She looked frantically back and forth between the multi-million-dollar documents and my calm face. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling violently, "why on earth didn't you tell us about this massive success?" "Because you stopped asking," I replied quietly, staring right into her eyes. The simple, undeniable, brutal truth hung heavily in the air between us, completely suffocating them in their own guilt. Edward desperately reached across the table and snatched the glossy press release. He started skimming the content rapidly, his eyes wide with intense jealousy and rising panic. "This document specifically mentions your development of the core algorithm while working as a barista," he read aloud, his voice dripping with pure disbelief and horror. "Yes, Edward," I nodded slowly. "The loud, dirty coffee shop right by the university campus. I worked there grinding beans, taking out the trash, and scrubbing toilets for 3 solid years just to pay my rent after all of you aggressively cut me off and left me to starve." My mother brought a shaking hand to her chest, trying instantly to play the innocent victim perfectly. We simply thought that job was just a..." She trailed off, entirely unable to find the right words to excuse her horrific parenting. "Just a what, Victoria?" I pushed back hard, absolutely refusing to let her off the hook. "A stupid hobby? A rebellious phase? A massive, embarrassing failure? You never actually asked how I was surviving. None of you did." I kept my voice perfectly level despite the immense, righteous heat rising powerfully in my chest. My father was still furiously and desperately processing the financial documents on the table. I could literally see the gears grinding in his head. He had just fully realized exactly how much equity I held. He realized with terrifying clarity that his discarded son was a self-made multimillionaire, entirely independent of his control, his money, and his influence. He abruptly cleared his throat, sat up straight, completely shifted his posture, and activated his smooth, highly persuasive, incredibly fake CEO voice. "Arthur, my boy, this is quite an extraordinary, massive accomplishment," he said smoothly, trying desperately to sound paternal and proud. Perhaps we have been entirely too hasty in our harsh assessment of your chosen path. We clearly, deeply misunderstood your grand vision." I almost laughed out loud at the absolute, disgusting transparency of his words. One single multimillion-dollar exit, one incredibly fat check, and suddenly I was entirely worthy of his love and consideration again. Suddenly, I was a true Sterling. "The Disownment document is already signed," I reminded him coldly, tapping the pocket of my blazer where the heavy letter rested. "By every single one of you. Legal documents can easily and quickly be amended, son," he countered smoothly, offering a fake, highly reassuring, snake-like smile. "We can tear that terrible paper up right now. We can discuss deeply integrating your new capital and your brilliant tech into the family firm's investment portfolio. Some things should absolutely never be amended," I said firmly, my voice turning to stone. I reached across the table, quickly gathered my highly valuable acquisition materials, and neatly, deliberately returned them to my leather portfolio. "You have all made your position perfectly, legally clear over the last 4 agonizing years, and I am simply respecting your final decision." Arthur, please listen to us. My mother pleaded frantically. She reached out and grabbed my hand tightly across the table. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the chandelier light, flashing brilliantly in my eyes. We are your family. You belong with us. We love you. No, Victoria, I said gently, firmly pulling my hand away from her desperate, clawing grasp. You are the Sterlings. I am just Arthur now. You made absolutely sure of that. I stood up slowly from the table, tucking the heavy portfolio securely and permanently under my arm. Edward's phone remained completely dark and useless in his shaking hand on the table. The entire narrative had completely escaped their iron grip, and the story was absolutely no longer following their expected, pathetic, cruel script. Your arrangement, as you so elegantly called it, works perfectly for me, I said, looking down at the three of them with pure pity. I reached up and straightened the lapels of my expensive blazer. You wanted a clean break. You've got one. Do not ever contact me again. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully through the crowded, buzzing restaurant. I did not look back once. Every single step I took toward the exit felt incredibly lighter than the last. The massive, suffocating weight of their expectations that I had carried on my shoulders since I was a small child simply evaporated into the thin air. I pushed through the heavy wooden front doors of Maison Lumière and stepped out into the warm, incredibly vibrant evening air outside. The Chicago summer evening completely embraced me like a warm hug. The air was warm, filled with the loud sounds of blaring taxi horns, people laughing freely, and the distant, rhythmic rumble of the elevated train. It was real life. It was messy, loud, and wonderfully, beautifully unpredictable. As I stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the freedom, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Marcus. Team celebration at Murphy's Pub in an hour. You coming? I smiled, a real, genuine, teeth-baring smile, and typed back quickly. On my way. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Fast forward exactly 6 months into the future. I was sitting comfortably in my massive, sprawling glass-walled corner office on the 32nd floor of the North Star Logistics corporate tower, looking out over the breathtaking, sprawling Chicago skyline. My professional transition into the highly coveted Director of Implementation Strategy role had been entirely, wonderfully seamless. The RootLogic software was fully and successfully integrated into their global systems, actively saving the massive company tens of millions of dollars in waste, and my dedicated 12-person team was absolutely thriving in their new corporate environment. I was finally, truly living the peaceful, abundant life I had tirelessly built for myself from the absolute ground up. Meanwhile, just a few miles across town in the financial district, the legendary Sterling Financial Group was actively, spectacularly burning to the absolute ground. I didn't even have to look hard to find the news. It was aggressively splashed across the front page of every single major financial publication, blog, and newspaper in the country. Edward, the beloved golden child, the supposed financial prodigy who was destined to rule the empire, had gotten dangerously, fatally arrogant. Driven by a desperate, toxic need to aggressively prove he was vastly superior to the younger brother who had just publicly humiliated him and secured a multi-million-dollar tech exit, Edward had acted recklessly. Without consulting the senior partners, he had heavily funneled massive amounts of the firm's liquid capital into a highly questionable series of incredibly volatile, untested tech startups and highly shady commercial real estate ventures. He desperately wanted a quick, massive, headline-grabbing return on investment to heavily inflate his own fragile ego. Instead, the unpredictable market violently and ruthlessly corrected itself. The fragile tech bubble burst overnight, and the overinflated commercial real estate market tanked spectacularly. Edward's aggressive, foolish investments were entirely, completely wiped out in a matter of days. The massive family firm was suddenly facing catastrophic, unprecedented margin calls from their furious lenders. They simply didn't have the liquid cash on hand to cover their incredibly aggressive, foolish bets. The resulting fallout was spectacularly brutal and incredibly, humiliatingly public. Major, long-term legacy clients began aggressively pulling their massive accounts, fleeing the sinking ship. A large group of highly wealthy, incredibly furious investors officially filed a massive, multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit against my father and Edward, citing gross negligence, fraud, and a severe breach of fiduciary duty. The pristine sterling legacy, built carefully over 3 unbroken generations, was completely unraveling into absolute dust in a matter of a few short weeks. The absolute, devastating cherry on top of this massive disaster was the shocking revelation regarding my Uncle Henry. During the frantic, desperate internal financial audits conducted by panicked outside accounting firms trying to see exactly where all the money had vanished, a dark secret was uncovered. It was definitively proven that Uncle Henry had been quietly, systematically, and maliciously embezzling small but significant amounts of company funds for years. The cowardly man who had happily acted as my father's loyal spy, the man who had pretended to care about my struggles while I was freezing in a cheap apartment, was desperately trying to secretly secure his own lavish retirement before the entire ship sank. My father, in a fit of absolute, blinding rage, ruthlessly fired his own brother on the spot and publicly threatened him with severe legal action, completely and permanently fracturing whatever tiny fragments were left of their extended family unit. I sat in my high-rise office and watched it all unfold in the daily news from a safe, comfortable distance, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical, highly satisfying sense of absolute closure. Then, on a dreary, rainy Tuesday afternoon, the incredibly professional receptionist buzzed my private office phone. She sounded incredibly nervous and slightly confused. She told me, her voice hushed, that 3 individuals were currently waiting in the high-security lobby downstairs, aggressively and loudly demanding to see me immediately. They boldly claimed they were my immediate family. I paused, looking at the blinking light on my phone. I could have easily had security toss them out onto the wet street without ever seeing their faces. But I didn't. I calmly authorized security to send them up the private elevator to my executive floor. I deeply needed to see this massive shift in power with my own 2 eyes. When the polished silver elevator doors slid open, Charles, Victoria, and Edward stepped out hesitantly. They looked absolutely, remarkably horrendous. The arrogant, untouchable swagger they had paraded around Maison Lumière was entirely, utterly gone. My father looked like he had aged 10 years and 6 months. His previously immaculate, expensive suit now hanging loosely and sadly on his rapidly thinning frame. Edward looked completely terrified, massive dark circles under his bloodshot eyes, his hands visibly shaking as he clutched a leather briefcase. My mother was still desperately clutching a highly expensive designer handbag like a shield, but her face was incredibly pale, drawn, and completely devoid of her usual haughty makeup. They walked slowly, almost timidly, into my massive, beautifully decorated corner office. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them a seat. I simply leaned back comfortably in my expensive ergonomic chair, steepled my fingers under my chin, and waited in absolute silence for them to speak first. My father was the first to finally break the heavy silence. His voice was incredibly raspy, entirely stripped of its usual booming, commanding boardroom authority. "Arthur," he started, his eyes darting nervously around at the expensive modern artwork and the sprawling million-dollar view of the city behind me. We desperately need to talk. As a family." "We are absolutely not a family, Charles." I corrected him immediately, my voice ice-cold and utterly unyielding. "I have the highly binding legal paperwork safely locked in my desk drawer that explicitly proves it. You happily signed it yourself with your favorite fountain pen." Edward stepped forward, his massive ego and pride completely, irreparably shattered. He literally dropped to his knees right there on the expensive, plush carpet of my office. It was a highly pathetic, deeply nauseating sight. "Arthur, please, I am begging you," he pleaded, his voice cracking and breaking. I'm completely ruined. The massive lawsuit is going to absolutely destroy me. The bank is going to take my house. The courts are going to aggressively seize all my assets. The firm desperately needs a massive capital injection immediately, or we are officially filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Friday afternoon. And you want my money to save you? I stated flatly. It wasn't a question. It was a cold, hard fact. It's not just about the money, Arthur. My mother pleaded frantically, stepping forward and wiping a highly rehearsed, fake tear from her eye. It's about the family legacy. It's our prestigious name. You have the massive capital from the North Star acquisition. You can easily, effortlessly save the firm. You can save your only brother from prison. I looked at the three of them standing in my office, demanding my hard-earned resources. I thought back to the agonizing, terrifying nights I spent shivering violently in my freezing apartment because I couldn't afford the heating bill. I thought about the days I went painfully hungry because they maliciously froze my college fund to teach me a lesson. I thought about Edward viciously bribing my desperate roommate to completely destroy my life's work. I thought about the cruel, deeply arrogant, highly satisfied smiles on their faces at Maison Lumiere when they gleefully handed me that disownment letter. Edward, I said, looking down at my kneeling, sobbing brother with absolute disgust. Do you happen to remember exactly what Charles told me in his mahogany office 4 years ago, when I simply asked him to emotionally support my career change? Edward looked up at me, completely confused and absolutely terrified. He shook his head weakly. I shifted my hard gaze directly to my father, staring right through him. You told me very clearly that family tradition is absolutely not a math problem you can optimize. I quoted his exact words perfectly. Well, Charles, family loyalty is absolutely not a massive corporate bailout you can demand when your terrible, reckless investments fail completely. You are standing here asking me to optimize your massive, pathetic financial losses. And the answer is absolutely, unequivocally, permanently no. My father's pale face suddenly flushed with intense anger, the old, toxic arrogance flaring up violently for a brief second. You would just sit there in your fancy chair and let your own flesh and blood face absolute financial ruin? He spat, his voice rising. You did exactly that to me, I replied calmly, not raising my voice a single decibel. The only massive difference is, I didn't deserve it. You absolutely do. I reached over calmly and firmly pressed the glowing intercom button on my desk. Security, please come up to my office immediately. I have 3 unauthorized, highly disruptive individuals who need to be escorted completely off the premises and banned from the building. Arthur, you can't possibly do this to us? My mother shrieked, dropping her fake composure entirely, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. I already did, I said. I turned my expensive chair around to face the massive window, looking out over the beautiful city, entirely dismissing their existence. I sat perfectly still and listened to the heavy, authoritative footsteps of the security guards entering the room. I listened to my family's desperate, angry, pathetic shouting as they were forcibly grabbed and escorted to the elevators. I didn't turn around until the heavy glass doors clicked shut and the office was perfectly, beautifully silent once again. Exactly 2 weeks after that highly satisfying confrontation in my office, I stood quietly in a solemn, wood-paneled courtroom in downtown Chicago. There were no flashing press cameras, no grand audience of socialites, just a very tired-looking municipal judge, my highly skilled personal lawyer, Mr. Miller, and the faint, steady hum of the courthouse ventilation system. I raised my right hand, swore a solemn legal oath, signed a stack of highly important documents, and officially, legally changed my name forever. I did not want a single lingering trace of the toxic Sterling legacy attached to my bright future. I legally changed my last name to Vance. It was the maiden name of Marcus's mother. She was a wonderful, incredibly warm, hard-working woman who had fed me hot, home-cooked meals when I was starving. She had generously offered me a safe place to sleep on her living room couch during the lonely holidays when I had absolutely nowhere else to go. She had treated me like a real, beloved son when my own biological mother had completely abandoned me to the wolves. I became Arthur Vance. Walking out of that courtroom, it felt like a massive, cleansing breath of fresh air filling lungs that had been suffocating for decades. When I walked down the courthouse steps holding the stamped, highly official legal decree in my hand, it honestly felt like attending a funeral. But it wasn't a sad, deeply tragic funeral. It was a deeply necessary, incredibly beautiful funeral for the scared, desperate, anxious young man I used to be. The confused boy who constantly, desperately craved the validation of a cruel, toxic father. The anxious boy who wanted to force himself to fit into a rigid, soul-crushing mold that was slowly killing his spirit. That boy was officially dead and permanently buried. In his place stood a strong, capable man who had taken full legal and absolute emotional custody of his own life. That evening, I hosted a small, highly private dinner party at my beautiful new home. I didn't book a highly visible table at a pretentious 5-star French restaurant to show off my wealth. I cooked the warm, comforting food myself, standing in my own kitchen. I invited Marcus, Chloe, Mr. Harrison from North Star, Sarah the angel investor, and Marcus's mother. We all sat around a massive, rustic wooden dining table, eating great food, laughing loudly, and sharing wonderful stories. There were absolutely no hidden agendas at that table. There were no phones secretly recording our every move for blackmail. There were absolutely no toxic expectations other than pure, genuine human connection and mutual respect. As I looked around that warm table, listening to the loud laughter filling the room, I finally, truly realized what the word family actually meant. My biological family, the Sterlings, eventually lost absolutely everything. The massive, highly publicized class action lawsuit completely drained their remaining liquid assets and destroyed their credit. The bank officially and aggressively foreclosed on the sprawling, historic lakefront mansion that had been in the family for generations. I heard through the corporate grapevine that Edward was currently working a deeply miserable, high-stress, mid-level sales job in a completely different state, barely scraping by. Charles and Victoria were horribly forced to downsize to a small, incredibly modest condo on the outskirts of the city, their precious social standing utterly and permanently annihilated. I didn't feel a sick sense of joy at their massive suffering, but I didn't feel a single shred of pity for them, either. They simply became distant strangers to me, irrelevant characters in a very old, dark chapter of a book I had long since finished reading and put away. The heavy cream-colored Disownment letter they handed me that fateful night at Maison Lumière still exists today. I didn't burn it in a fit of rage. I didn't throw it away in the trash. I actually took it to a gallery and had it professionally, beautifully framed in thick black wood. It hangs directly behind my desk in my quiet home office. I keep it prominently displayed there not out of lingering anger or resentment, but as a constant, incredibly powerful daily reminder. A reminder that sometimes the absolute worst thing someone can possibly do to you, aggressively rejecting you, cruelly casting you out, looking you in the eye and telling you that you are entirely worthless, is actually the greatest, most profound gift they could ever possibly give you. Because their harsh, absolute rejection violently forced me to find my own deep inner strength. Their calculated cruelty forced me to build my own highly successful empire from scratch. They arrogantly thought they were writing the final, humiliating ending to my pathetic story. They had absolutely no idea they were just handing me a blank page and a pen to write my own incredible, unstoppable beginning. If you are listening to this right now, and you have ever been severely underestimated, deeply manipulated, or completely overlooked by the exact people who should have believed in you first, I want you to hear this loud and clear. True success is absolutely not about desperately trying to prove those toxic people wrong. Do not waste your precious, limited energy trying to get messy revenge or trying to force them to finally see your immense worth. Success is entirely about proving yourself right. Your dignified silence, your ironclad boundaries, and your relentless, uncompromising dedication to your own personal growth can rapidly become your absolute greatest strength. When you put your head down, ignore the vicious noise, and focus entirely on building something real, whether that is a thriving business, a loving, peaceful home, or simply a stable, happy life, your undeniable results will eventually speak loud enough to completely deafen your harshest critics. You have the absolute, undeniable right to divorce yourself from anyone who treats your very existence as a burden, regardless of whether or not they share your DNA. You have the absolute right to take full, uncompromising custody of your own future and your own happiness. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own toxic family? Have you ever had to make the terrifying decision to walk away from abusive relatives just to protect your own peace and build your own life? Share your incredible story in the comments below, and don't forget to boldly like and subscribe so you absolutely don't miss the next journey. Remember, absolutely nobody else gets to hold the pen to your life story unless you willingly hand it to them. Keep building, keep setting those ironclad boundaries, and I will see you in the next video.